Well, welcome to the workshop final briefings. So as we listen to these presentations today, I want you to think about these 5 issues. And those of you who are in the groups, think about how much more you know about these problems than you did the day our class started. Think about how well you've worked together to come up with the results that you've come up with. As you watch these presentations, be impressed with how they will be all done within the time allotted to them. And they've been thought through so that they're really excellent versions of science communication, which is what we worked so hard to do this semester. So we're going to start with Professor Apson's group, which is going to talk about the Fashion Environmental Accountability Act, and then we'll go through all of our other presentations. So let's begin.
Okay, hello everybody and good morning. My name is Maxwell Howland and I will be giving our final briefing for the summer semester on New York State Assembly Bill 4631B, the Fashion Environmental Accountability Act. So first I wanted to say thank you to our advising professor, Dr. Apson, and to the rest of our team. We come from a diverse cultural and personal background that really allowed us to develop a deeper and more complex understanding of the bill at hand and the science behind the problem and the solution. So the fashion industry is a major contributor to negative global environmental and human damage. Globally, the sector contributes roughly 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, including methane production from the raising of cattle and the deforestation that accompanies this, and CO2 and nitrous oxide from the extraction and manufacturing of synthetic fibers from petroleum. To put this in perspective, the fashion industry produces more carbon emissions than international flight and maritime travel combined. The fashion industry additionally releases numerous toxic chemicals into ecologically and socially important ecosystems. Chemicals like PCBs, phthalates, and other forever chemicals persist in the environment indefinitely, accumulating and cycling between aquatic ecosystems, the atmosphere, and potentially into people living around affected areas or consuming affected products. Finally, the race to the bottom for cheap labor and materials leads to unsafe working conditions, low wages, and extremely high demands on people. And these impacts are expected to intensify with rising global populations and the number of micro-trends accelerating fashion consumption. The average American throws away about 81 pounds of clothing per year, and globally we produce enough textile waste to fill the Sydney harbor annually. Thus, we have the proposal of the Fashion Environmental Accountability Act. So the act identifies major fashion houses such as Prada or Coach, which we will be examining later, as the leaders of the fashion industry. The major fashion houses are the groups who take the majority of the earnings, benefiting most from the current state of affairs, and they are the groups with the greatest authority over their suppliers and finishers. The bill intends to make fashion houses recognize their position in this hierarchy and to describe in detail where their materials are coming from and who is working for them. The bill targets companies with global revenues with revenues in the state of New York exceeding $100 million annually. This threshold captures roughly 2% of fashion producers, but it represents over 40% of the industry's revenue, making this approach highly targeted and efficient. So the bill requires companies to detail their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and detail their greenhouse gas emissions and chemical discharge for 50% of their Tier 4 raw materials and Tier 3 thread and yarn producers, and for 75% of their Tier 2 weavers and dyers, and their Tier 1 producers of sewn and finished products. So the compilation of each of these will culminate in the annual due diligence report. The report will allow fashion houses to identify major areas of atmospheric and chemical discharge and to remove themselves from situations producing actual or potential harm to people or the environment. So if they do not provide an adequate accounting of their practices, companies will incur serious financial penalties that will be used to establish the Fashion Remediation Fund. So now why would making manufacturers chart and map suppliers and their discharge affect change? Because we know now that what gets measured gets done. So mapping of inputs such as water used to grow raw materials or dye clothing, chemicals used to prepare leather goods and dye fabrics, and the labor required to do these things, and the subsequent processing of them into maps of global supply chains across each tier of production and performing risk assessment on their operation methods allows for the output of the mandated due diligence report. The due diligence report is a catalog of everything that has gone into production. It tells us exactly how many gallons of water were used to produce the jacket I'm wearing and how many and which chemicals were used to produce the tie. It tells us what are the major contributing factors that make this industry detrimental to planetary health. So this level of transparency is unprecedented in the fashion industry, as currently most brands can only trace about 30 to 40% of their suppliers beyond their direct company-owned manufacturers. So then just below outputs, we see the 2019 Prada Sustainability Report, which we will get to in just a moment. But through the understanding provided by due diligence reports, we may reach the desired outcome of reduced greenhouse gas emissions related to reduced chemical discharge in the environment and improved outcomes for communities. So what does this look like in practice? So this is an excerpt of the Prada Sustainability Report from 2019 that would put them in compliance with the terms of the legislation. This is the summation of large amounts of data that they have collected on each tier of their supply chain, from raw material sourcing and their localization of manufacturing suppliers on the left of the screen, and data on emissions from each scope of their activities over here on the right. So they chart their suppliers of their tier 4 raw material producers and their tier 1 manufacturers, as well as detailing CO2 emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3. So additionally, the report also contains their findings as to their chemical management and their treatment of wastewater. It also includes their targets and their progress to reaching these targets. This report is, and for all other companies under the bill, will be available on their company website. So this allows major fashion houses to identify areas of environmental and social risk in their supply chain and identify areas that allow for the greatest levels of improvement. We see on the right that scope 3 in the brackets is a significantly larger fraction of overall emissions than scope 1 and 2 for Prada. And so this is true of every major fashion company, Scope 3 emissions comprise roughly 90 to 95% of all emissions from the industry. So how can fashion houses reduce their Scope 3 emission levels? Well, Coach New York offers insight to how this can be achieved via their Coachtopia label. Many of their products are made of leather, a material with a high environmental impact associated with the raising of cattle and methane emissions, as well as the release of several toxic chemicals and heavy metals from the tanning process. So these products seek to develop a circular economy whereby goods may be reused and recycled to develop new products. Leather is used from items that do not pass inspections or from the trimmings of full hides that are used to produce new bags. And the circular design of this product means that it has a 71% lower carbon footprint than a new leather bag, and a significantly lower impact than other potential alternative materials like vegan leather, which is typically made from petroleum products. So this circular approach represents exactly the kind of change that the bill aims to incentivize. By requiring detailed reporting, companies will be better positioned to identify waste streams that can be converted into resources. Other brands are also following in this path, like Patagonia's Warren Wear program and Stella McCartney's bio-based materials research show that this is not just a one-off in the industry. So in cases where the due diligence requirement is not met, companies will have 30 days to remedy the issue, or they may be fined $15,000 per day until they are in compliance. Over the course of the year, this totals to $5.5 million, which even for a company making over $100 million is not a hit that they will take lightly. So the fine encourages major fashion houses to be more transparent and responsible for their actions by pushing them to adequately understand their production processes. By assessing a fine for not meeting the requirements outlined in the bill, the industry is given a serious incentive to work in concert to reduce their their inputs, and the resulting emissions. So the funds collected in the Fashion Remediation Fund will then be used to remedy ecological damage. So what are the next steps for SOWN? We will develop our implementation plan working with fashion houses to determine the repercussions of the bill. So what will be the cost to producers and the ensuing cost to consumers? We will work to better understand interagency communication between the New York Department of State, who will review the due diligence reports, and the New York Department of Justice, who is responsible for assessing fines when companies' reports do not meet the requirements laid out in the bill, and how these organizations will bear the burden of this responsibility. We will determine the political and economic considerations that will allow for or complicate the bill's passage by looking at similar legislation in California and the EU. And finally, we will get our tickets for the upcoming Devil Wears Prada 2 movie. Thank you. Any questions?
Hello. You mentioned that the remediation fund will be used for ecological restoration. Is this just in New York, or will it be going to downstream places where a lot of these fabrics are manufactured?
Yeah, so that is not clear in the language of the bill. Obviously, included in the race to the bottom, most of this production takes place outside of the United States. So whether the New York State Department of Justice will be sending these fines to remedy ecological damage in, Dhaka or in China or in Chile is yet to be determined.
Thank you. I believe exactly 4 weeks ago, I asked a question in the midterm briefing that we weren't ready to answer yet, and I'll pose it again. Maybe you have come up with the looking at the solutions. Might there be a risk of driving out fashion producers out of New York such that they don't have to abide by these laws?
New York is such a large market, and having your products being worn by people in New York State is so important that I do not believe that would be the case.
Thank you.